Well, I'm going to move on to the next section here in a second, but I want to correlate it with something that is very much real and happening, and I think is probably definitely something that the Russians are paying attention to, because they've been talking about this, and they've been looking at the Middle East, and they've been looking at what the Iranian side has done and how they have really neutralized the superpower of the United States, regardless of how much more power we have on the spreadsheet than the Iranian side does. We've been neutralized because Iran has shown that they have the ability to strike long range on target, and that they can bring all of that oil infrastructure of our allies in the region under severe consequences. And if we push harder, and I hope President Trump doesn't go, he threatened again yesterday that we may do that again to Iran. Let's hope that he doesn't do that, because it's pretty clear Iran will strike, and it will cause devastation to the global economy if oil is taken offline. That's really problematic by itself. But as you continue to point out here in your article, you said that the economic problems that this could cause in Europe could dwarf that because of using similar tactics. It says the point is cruelly reinforced by simultaneous Russian strikes that systematically dismantle Europe's energy infrastructure, gas terminals, power stations, grid interconnectors, storage facilities. Obviously, Ukraine physically has suffered a lot of these, and even Russia has as well. But the West is definitely not prepared engineering-wise to recover these, which both Russia and Ukraine are, with the same clinical precision applied to Ukraine's grid from 22 onwards. Acutely vulnerable as the world's largest regional hydrocarbon importer at 12.8 million barrels per day, Europe's energy system is already under severe strain. The consequences of self-defeating sanctions on Russian oil and gas recently compounded by the Strait of Hormuz energy shock. One of the things I wonder if you can talk about here, because it's not commonly understood, and it is my understanding, and I'm asking as much as I am declaring, my understanding is that there are relatively few oil facilities and oil terminals that are throughout all of Europe, and there's not that many you would have to take down that would cripple everybody's energy system and their economy. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is accurate. And the reason is, Danny, that now that we have sanctioned Russia and cut off access to all the fuels that would have come through Russia, then we're left with those fuels which come from the other two key locations. There are locations in the North Sea, not huge amounts. There's enough for Norway to actually power itself, and Britain has about half of its fuel potential from the North Sea, but the rest of it's imported, Danny. So it's imported, and so when it comes into places like Rotterdam, it comes into places like Southampton, it comes into places like Milford Haven, which is in Wales. There's a Spanish location, I can't remember which one it is, but these locations are exquisitely vulnerable. And again, no defense is possible. So, and I remember doing some analysis just after 9/11, Danny, when I was in the policy planning department of the MOD, and we soon found that an attack on a liquid natural gas, the LNG facility, would have subnuclear consequences. So, you don't take long to actually start to take out the whole of the energy infrastructure. Again, I'm not suggesting that this would happen, but it's a very plausible scenario if there's an escalation. And it's an escalation about which we would really struggle to do. But actually, it's by no means implausible, because, of course, we're doing this to Russia at the moment. So why would we think that they wouldn't respond in the same way that we have? Especially if, as I guess, that United States is standing on the sidelines because it's begun to think more self-interestedly about whether it wants to fight Russia. So it would have been difficult anyway in a normal circumstance, but the circumstance we're in is that we've already cut ourselves off from 40% of our diesel, which used to come in from Russia, and indeed fertilizer. And then we've put sanctions on Russian oil, which of course has raised the price of oil worldwide. And last but by no means least, the Strait of Hormuz has happened, and that's taken out, again, somewhere between 13 and 15 million barrels per day of oil, again causing acute pressure in Europe. Because the point about Europe is that apart from the Norwegians on their own and the Brits with a little bit of help from the North Sea, we crucially rely on imported oil, crucially. And how does that oil even get to us, even before we actually get to the refineries? of course, there is a Russian submarine force against which we have very, very little capacity to defend ourselves. I mean, the anti-submarine forces, which I used to be part of, they're about a tenth of the size that they were. I think Britain has five or six frigates, which is what we used. When I was serving, we frigates and destroyers about 12 in total. When I was serving, we had between 70 and 80. They're very, very significant anti-submarine force, and our nuclear submarines aren't doing that great either in terms of reliability.
So to make sure I understand correctly, and I don't want to mischaracterize anything that you're suggesting or that you've written, but you're not necessarily saying Russia will do these things. They have threatened some of them, but you're saying that if they take the course of action you're suggesting, these are the likely outcomes, is what you're describing. Is that accurate?
I think a better word would be plausible. But it's very plausible that they could do this. And I think the key thing, it's whenever you do risk analysis, and you hear a lot about risk analysis in the private sector, but one of the most important things of risk analysis that you look at the what's called the percentage of the risk and the impact. Now, even if what I'm talking about is sort of 1 in 4 plausibility, the impact on the European economy is catastrophic, Danny. So, and not only on the European economy, but even if the Europeans sued for peace and said, okay, we don't like the way in which you've destroyed our energy infrastructure, the consequences will continue to play out after the ceasefire. What we'll see, no doubt, is runs on the pound, on the euro. We'll see a rise in bond prices, which will lead to much higher government expenditure on interest rates. We would see stock market crashes. I mean, the economic consequences would be profound. And
I'm sorry, I don't want to jump ahead, but because before we get to that portion, because you do talk about that in section number 6. What you also wrote there is, if Russia begins to hit all these targets you just mentioned with the oil, the energy production, et cetera, you write that the lights begin to go out. More importantly, without diesel, Europe's farming, fishing, and food logistics systems all fail. Only 2 to 3 months into the conflict, Europe's economic situation is now perilous. What is the reason for your pessimism on that, and why such a short period of time? Because one may imagine, say, okay, well, Russia's been hitting a lot of these targets in Ukraine for a long time, and they figure a way to overcome them. And on the one hand, you may say, and this again is more of a question, you may say, well, they did. Your Ukraine side did endure that, and they have maintained solvency. But you can also argue they maintained solvency because of the 50 nations in Europe and elsewhere that have continued to support them. And the Europe wouldn't have 50 nations to help them. So they perversely may be more vulnerable than the one nation of Ukraine. How do you see it?
No, that fundamentally is the key point. And the key point is that Europe is critically reliant on oil and liquid natural gas imports. Critically, I think we import something like 12.5 million barrels per day, Danny. So, and as I say, the vast majority of that is imported. So as soon as you cut those imports off, and this is coming on top of the Straits of Hormuz and on top of already cutting off access to the only land-based resources coming via pipelines from Russia, then suddenly you're going to be running short of all your fuels. Now, the electricity may stay on, although even electricity requires people doing maintenance, the key electrical things, and all of those maintenance activities are fueled by trucks and JCBs and other things which use diesel. The critical fuel here is we're so critically dependent on it. I mean, a lot of people talk about gasoline, says it's fine. We're moving to electric cars. Well, there are no electric tractors here, I can tell you. There are no electric combine harvesters. Every fishing vessel that I can think of in the British Isles, there may be 1 or 2 exceptions, but there are probably a couple of thousand, is powered by diesel. So as soon as you take the diesel out of the equation, then suddenly the whole of the farming systems, starts to fall apart. And the fundamental issue here, Daniel, as well, is you can't say, oh, don't worry, we'll import it. Because what if you can't get the imports in? What if you can't get the imports of food in? I seem to remember during the firemen's strike, which we had in this country about sort of 15 years ago, that the average sort of level of refined fuels is about 9 days. So that's not oil and gas, but that's refined fuels. But it gives you a sense of the vulnerability. And let's forget as well that actually, what have we been doing across the world during the Strait of Hormuz crisis? We've been spending our strategic petroleum reserves, and we've been reducing our inventories of oil and gas. So, we're acutely vulnerable, I would say. So that's why I'm pessimistic. And fundamentally, I go back to something that I said probably about a couple of months ago, Danny, when we were talking about the Strait of Hormuz, which is that there is a critical relationship between the use of energy and gross domestic product. And so if you suddenly take the amount of energy that we're talking about out of the system, then you'll see the same in terms of economic contraction. I mean, the general estimate, I think, for Ukraine, and that's even with access to fuels from the West, the general estimate is a reduction in GDP of 30%. I mean, that is catastrophic in a modern industrial country.
10% equals to depression, just to put that in context.
Yeah, the United States, I think at the height of the Great Depression, was about 15.9%, Danny. It's that sort of figure. So 30%. I mean, let's be clear, if it weren't for European loans and other loans, Ukraine's a failed state. It cannot exist without those. So Ukraine's a failed state. And so the question is, do we want a failed superstate, which is Europe? Now, again, I just want to emphasize here, Danny, as well, I'm not suggesting that this is a forecast, but I do think it's highly plausible. And even if it's only remotely plausible, then we should at least be discussing this publicly. And our politicians should be at least doing the risk analysis for us and telling us what they assess the risk to be. Because I can see no sign anywhere amongst any of our politicians on either side of the Atlantic that they've even thought about the risk, let alone bother to analyze them.
Well, so what do you say to those who are discussing this and they say, oh yeah, but Russia would never do all that stuff. They would never strike even with conventional weapons, all those targets you talked about, because France and UK both have nuclear weapons of their own, and they would use them if they're attacked by the Russian side there. What do you say to that?
Well, I say that France and Britain will be committing suicide. Committing suicide for the people, because we were using nuclear weapons against the most powerful nuclear armed state in the world, and the idea that there would be anything other than a response with overwhelming use of nuclear weapons is fantasy. So it's a big call for Macron and what will probably be Andy Burnham to make. But the call that I have to take is that, do you want to respond with nuclear weapons, which will result in the destruction of Britain and the destruction of France? And my guess is that unless they're completely clueless, they'll probably say no to committing national suicide. Again, because of the way this escalation could happen, you can see why I think it's something that we should be talking about. I mean, I know that you're worried about it. I'm worried about it, but what really worries me, there is very, very little public debate about it. And the reason is because the mainstream media just avoid it. And nobody amongst our politicians or military leaders seems to have even considered the risks.
They don't, and I want to move to the end of your article here, because I think it's definitely the thing that kind of got my interest the most and sobering. So you say only 3 months into the conflict of this scenario, if it plays out the way that you argue it could, the human costs are already severe. Military casualties are orders of magnitude higher than Western and NATO losses in 25 years of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But military surrender is not the end. It's just the beginning. With its energy system shattered, European industrial production is collapsing. Unemployment is surging. Europe's largest countries, other than Germany, are already shouldering debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. What does that do to Europe if it goes down this path? Meaning that if we get into a conflict with Russia and it stays only in the air, and there's no Red Army that comes rolling across, but it just stays in the air, what is the impact for Europe, and how long does it take to undo that damage?
The impact is, with this destruction of the energy system, is nothing other than catastrophic. Now, I think there's an open question about how the Russians might do it. In Russia's situation, I'd be selective, and I would probably concentrate on what I think are the three key bellicose nations, which is the E3, that's Britain, France, and Germany. I don't know, but it's just a guess, Danny. I'm just putting myself in Putin, the General Staff's position. But taking 30 or 40 or 50% of a GDP, then suddenly all of the services, a modern economy cannot function without adequate supplies of energy. I mean, I speak as somebody who's worked in the energy sector for the last 15 years, and I'm afraid to say that it's poorly understood. I used to say in the Navy that people were sea blind, and we always used to say it. In the energy industry, we'll often say that people are energy blind. The energy is something which comes out of you go to the gas station and put petrol in your tank, and it comes from a gas station. It's much more complicated than that, with long supply chains, and it takes decades as well in terms of investment. So I don't think Europe would ever get back to the same situation as before the war. And I think we'd be lucky to recover, depending on the degree of damage, to recover sort of 2/3 of our economic capacity that we had before the war. It's very difficult to say. You would have to model it. But as I say, energy infrastructure investment takes decades. We're talking about, we've got a power station which is being built in Somerset. I think we're sort of already into 15 years, getting towards 20 years. So it takes decades of investment. So taking it out makes a huge difference. And the other fundamental part of this, Danny, is that everybody thinks, okay, well, don't worry, we'll just go across to renewables and nuclear. Well, the problem is that both nuclear and renewables critically rely on fuels. They rely on diesel critically. How do you think that we actually build a nuclear power station? How do we power the cranes? I can tell you it's not with nuclear fuel. How do we put an offshore wind farm out? I can tell you it's not using electricity. We use diesel. We use diesel throughout the supply chain. So you take that away, and the ability to actually recover the energy industry and therefore recover the economic infrastructure is going to be very badly damaged at best.
Well, listen, I think that the best thing that we can do is to not prove your scenario correct. Let's don't even start going down that path, which is why that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this show today with your highlighting your article here, because we definitely want to get this into the public arena, let people argue about it and discuss it. But the bottom line is the thing that I hope really gets across is that in the event that this happens, because we push too hard with Russia and Russia crosses that Rubicon and does launch into Western Europe, the consequences could be horrible to catastrophic. And all of this is avoidable if we just sober ourselves up and engage in some normal diplomacy, give and take. We have leverage on Russia in some cases, but we're going to have to give some things to get some things. And if we do that, we don't have to go down this path, and we can continue to live in long into the future after this war is over. At least that's how I see it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Danny. As you'll have seen, I finished the article by saying there is an alternative path. It's called diplomacy. Why on earth anybody in the West thinks it's a good idea to have a peace conferences where one of the belligerents is not there is beyond me. It's diplomatic incompetence. Why anybody in the West think that it's rewarding Russia to be able to talk to them? It's diplomatic incompetence. So, for goodness sake, let's just start to talk diplomatic to the Russians. They will be difficult conversations. They always are at the end of wars, and they will probably stay difficult conversations for years, maybe even a decade or two. But much better to have those than to have a war again on the mainland of Europe, especially one which leads to catastrophic consequences for all our populations.